Welcome back. Today I'd like to talk about two crucial steps along the road to decipherment of hieroglyphs. Both involve a rather unusual antiquarian named William Banks. Banks came from a wealthy English family. He was well educated, attending Trinity College, Cambridge, where he became close friends with Lord Byron. William's father was a career politician, and William was expected to follow in his footsteps, and he did. In 1810, he took a seat in the House of Commons. But politics wasn't to his liking. He was far more interested in art and architecture. He could read Latin and Greek, was an accomplished artist and draftsman, and was extremely interested in the new discoveries being made in Egypt and the Middle East. He was also gay, and this was a serious matter in homophobic London in the early 19th century. The previous year, 21 young men had been hanged for merely having indecent thoughts. So William decided to leave London and go on the grand tour, and he wasn't eager to return. The year was 1815. In William Banks' time, it was part of a wealthy Englishman's education to make the grand tour. One was expected to go to Italy to see the ruins of Rome, to study the paintings and sculpture in Florence, and to experience the atmosphere and architecture of Venice. Then it would be off to Greece to see where Western civilization was born. The more adventurous and wealthy could continue on to Turkey and Egypt, and William Banks was both adventurous and wealthy. In the early part of the 19th century, there was no organized tourism in Egypt. It was pure adventure. In Cairo, one hired a dragoman, an interpreter and guide, a small ship and crew, and sailed up the Nile. The pace for the first half of the trip was determined by the winds. This was the journey south, because you were going against the current and were at the mercy of the wind. If there were no wind, sometimes the crews would walk along the banks of the river, pulling the ship at a painfully slow pace. So when you were traveling south, if you had the wind, you went with it. Often, when you arrived at Luxor, with all its fabulous temples, if you had the wind, you sailed on by. You could stop on the way back when you had the current with you and didn't need the wind. Banks' Grand Tour would last from 1815 to 1819, a full 4 years. He visited Egypt twice, first 1815 to 1816, before going on to the Holy Land, and then he returned to Egypt in 1818 for a second look. The highlight of the first trip was visiting the then extremely remote temple of Abu Simbel in Nubia. It had only recently been discovered by a Westerner, John Louis Burckhardt, a Swiss scholar and adventurer who traveled the Middle East dressed as an Arab. Several years earlier, Burckhardt had discovered the huge rock-cut temple, but was unable to enter it because the entrance was buried in tons of sand. He told Banks about it, and Banks was determined to see it. The trip to Abu Simbel was difficult and involved changing boats at the first cataract, then continuing on via boat and camels to the uncharted temple. William was amazed by the temple, and knowing that perhaps he was the first Englishman to see it inspired him even more. He desperately wanted to enter, but the mounds of sand covering the entrance were too large to move with his small crew. Banks was more than just an adventurer, however. He was a serious student of antiquity. He made sketches and vowed to return, and he did. The return is where he makes a major contribution to decipherment. But I'll save that story for next time. For now, let me outline his two other important contributions to cracking the code. When Banks reached Philae, the beautiful temple built on an island in the Nile, he fell in love with the place. Philae was built over a period of 3 centuries, during the Greco-Roman period, when Egypt was ruled by Greeks and then the Romans. Each Ptolemy or Roman emperor added his part to Philae. So it wasn't planned as a unit, it just growed. What's remarkable, given the way it was built, piece by piece, is its overall beauty. It is definitely special and has been called the Jewel of the Nile. For every traveler going up the Nile in the 19th century, Philae was a must-see. The monument bears the marks of these travelers, who often inscribed their arrival on the temple's walls. A kiosk built by the Emperor Trajan is covered with this early travelers' graffiti. Even military expeditions returning from the Sudan felt the place was sacred and left memorials to their dead carved on the ancient walls. Banks visited Philae well before most of these travelers and probably had the place to himself when he stopped there on his grand tour, and he too knew it was a special place. But the Philae that Banks visited is not the Philae that tourists visit today. When a dam was built at Aswan at the beginning of the last century, Philae was periodically flooded by the higher Nile waters held back behind the dam. Later in the century, when the dam was raised even higher, Philae was going to be completely flooded. So UNESCO organized a rescue operation. Philae was dismantled block by block and moved a half a mile away to a higher island where it was reassembled. So when we modern tourists see it, it's not where Banks saw it. And there's another important difference. Banks decided he had to have something from Philae for his estate back in England. There was a 20-foot-tall inscribed obelisk still resting on its original pedestal. And Banks made arrangements with Giovanni Belzoni, an Italian strongman who was making his living by excavating, finding sculptures, and selling them back in Europe. Belzoni agreed to ship both the pedestal and the obelisk to England for him. When Banks returned from his grand tour, he erected the obelisk on its pedestal on his estate, where it can be seen today. So modern tourists in Egypt only see a poor quality concrete replica of the obelisk, and most just walk by it without knowing what it is or the part that its original played in the decipherment of hieroglyphs. The important thing is that the base of the original obelisk has a Greek inscription, while the obelisk is in hieroglyphs, like the Rosetta Stone. It's bilingual, Greek and Egyptian. Banks could read the Greek, which bore the names of Ptolemy and Cleopatra. Ptolemy had already been deciphered, so Banks correctly deduced that the other cartouche must be Cleopatra. He sent his copy of the inscription to Thomas Young, who was looking at the hieroglyphs. He was able to confirm his earlier findings and also add some new letters of the alphabet. Let's look closely at the cartouche. It starts with the hill Q, which is close to the K sound. And since Cleopatra starts with a K sound, Young added that hieroglyph to his alphabet as a K sound. He was right. The Greeks were using the hill as a K. Remember, Cleopatra spelled with a kappa in Greek. The next letter, a lion, must be an L. And this confirmed that the letter in Ptolemy's name was that. So Young was both adding new letters and confirming letters he had already surmised from Ptolemy's name. The reed leaf and the rope, he already knew from Ptolemy's name. Also, he confirmed these. The vulture, the A, doesn't appear in Ptolemy. So Young had a new letter to add to his alphabet, concluding it had to be an A. Now the hand hieroglyph, the D sound, gave him a bit of a puzzle, but he figured it out. Its position corresponds to the T in Cleopatra's name. But Ptolemy also had a T in his name, and it wasn't the hand. It was the loaf hieroglyph. Young figured the two hieroglyphs had pretty much the same sound, and he was right with respect to the Greek pronunciation of Cleopatra. Cleopatra. Later, he would see it in other cartouches of Cleopatra's name, and it was often spelled with a loaf T. The mouth R doesn't appear in Ptolemy's name, so Young had a new arrow in his quiver, the letter R. Imagine how elated he must have been as he added more and more letters to the alphabet. He owed William Banks big time. Young even realized that the last two hieroglyphs, the egg and the loaf tea, had no phonetic value there, but were determiners for female queens, goddesses, and even princesses. Real progress was being made. So the bilingual obelisk and its pedestal were very important in extending the Egyptian alphabet. Still, they couldn't translate yet. Thomas Young was merely filling in the sounds. But this wasn't Banks' only contribution to decipherment. Remember, I said he made 3. His second was at the Temple of Abydos. Today, the Temple of Abydos is visited by millions of tourists each year. But when Banks found it, it was filled in with sand. We must also remember that hieroglyphs hadn't been translated yet, so no one knew who built Abu Simbel or Abydos Temple. It was all a mystery. Abydos is a very special temple for several reasons. First, it's dedicated primarily to Osiris, but also 6 other gods. According to Egyptian mythology, Osiris, the god of the dead, was buried at Abydos. So every Egyptian wanted to make a pilgrimage to Abydos to place an offering at Osiris's grave, so they too would be resurrected. Banks had the sand that choked the rooms inside the temple cleared and made an incredible discovery. He discovered a Hall of the Ancients. When pharaohs built a temple, they often listed all the pharaohs before them to show what a long lineage they had. This is the Hall of the Ancients, with the longest list of pharaohs ever discovered and in near perfect condition. Abydos was built by Seti I, the father of Ramses II, Ramses the Great. And in the Hall of the Ancients, you can see Seti with young Ramses reading the names of all the kings. Young Ramses, with his sidelock of youth, is holding a papyrus scroll. They're performing a religious ritual that will ensure that their ancestors have what they need in the next world. They're reading a prayer called the Hotep Dinisu in ancient Egyptian. And by the end of this course, you'll be able to read it, just as young Ramses did. By reading this prayer, Seti and Ramses are making sure that the deceased kings will have food and drink, cattle, geese, fine oils, everything that their ancestors would need in the next world. There's an ancient Egyptian saying that to say the name of the dead is to make him live again. So just by reading the names of their ancestors, the king and prince were giving them life. When Banks discovered this king's list, he understood it was important and made a very accurate copy of it to bring back to England for Thomas Young. This provided many more names for Young, so even more letters of the alphabet could be deduced. At this point in time, Frenchman Jean-François Champollion enters the picture, intending to beat the Englishman to the decipherment of hieroglyphs. Champollion was only 9 years old when the Rosetta Stone was discovered, but even then, he was a recognized prodigy of languages. By the time he was 11, he knew Latin and Greek, and soon went on to add Hebrew and Arabic to the list of languages he mastered. Joseph Fourier, one of Napoleon's savants in Egypt, heard about this young genius and invited him to his home. He showed Champollion the artifacts he had brought back from Egypt and explained that no one could yet read the hieroglyphs. Champollion vowed he would become the first. Now, 10 years later, Champollion and Young were in a race to decipher hieroglyphs, but neither could translate yet. Once again, Banks would provide the key. But that's for our next lecture. For now, it's enough to credit Banks with copying the king's list at Abydos and also for bringing back the bilingual pedestal and obelisk with Cleopatra's name. It's hard for us today to appreciate just how important the contributions of men like Banks, Young, and Champollion were to our view of civilization. What they did goes far beyond Egyptology and the decipherment of hieroglyphs. It affects our whole worldview. When Banks was clearing the sand from Abydos Temple, back in London, no one really knew how old Egypt was. Remember, the Denver Zodiac caused a tremendous controversy because it suggested Egypt was more than 2,000 years old. Everyone in Europe was convinced that Greece was the source of civilization. Once the hieroglyphs were deciphered and the Egyptian records could be read, the question had to be raised. Could Egypt be the source of civilization? There was tremendous resistance to this idea. Late in the 19th century, classicists were still claiming that Greece was where it all started. I find this incredible. It goes against all the evidence. And I don't just mean the Egyptian records. Of all people, classicists had access to what the Greeks had said about Egypt. Herodotus said Greece learned how to build in stone from the Egyptians. He was honored to acknowledge that Greek gods were derived from the much older Egyptian pantheon. He recounted how he was shocked by how far back Egyptians could trace their ancestors. There's even a Greek account of how Athens sent a delegation to Egypt for their advice about how to make the Olympic Games fair for the foreigners who competed. Greeks were bowing to Egyptian wisdom. Everything the ancient Greeks said about Egypt was being ignored by the classicists. After all, what do they know? They're Greeks. It's nuts. Why the resistance? I think they couldn't accept the idea that an African civilization could have been so advanced thousands of years before Europe had writing. It was racism. Think about what they would be forced to admit. Because the Egyptian language could now be read, thanks to Banks, Young, Champollion, et al., it was becoming clear that Egypt produced masterpieces of art thousands of years before Europe had Christianity. Worse, it was a good bet that monotheism, a concept basic to Western civilization, was first voiced in Egypt. The early contributions of the decipherers went far beyond Egyptology. They shook up the whole Eurocentric view of civilization. Today, Western civilization's debt to Egypt is well known and acknowledged. But it was a long, rocky road. In 1954, a book titled Stolen Legacy by George James attempted to point out our debt to Egypt, but it was tragically flawed, and scholars attacked it. The claims were overstated, and the scholarship was nearly non-existent. It's hard to imagine what Egyptian text the author could have been even thinking of when he said, "The Greeks were not the authors of Greek philosophy, but the black people of North Africa, the Egyptians." Pure nonsense. There were no Egyptian philosophical texts. That's one thing we didn't get from Egypt. In 1987, a far more serious book on the subject appeared, Black Athena by Martin Bernal. Here was a real Cambridge scholar who was pointing out the 19th century racism that refused to credit Egypt with her accomplishments. So far, so good, but the road is still rocky. You see, Bernal's expertise was Chinese political philosophy. And because he was writing on a subject outside his field of expertise, he made errors and overstated his case. This book, too, was widely criticized by my Egyptologist colleagues. But I still think it's worth reading. Look it up, and I think you'll enjoy it. Perhaps part of the reason for the extremely strong criticisms it received is the book's title. Black Athena correctly suggests Greek religion owed a debt to Egypt. But it raises the question of whether Egyptians are a black civilization, whatever that may mean. Interestingly, Bernal never discusses this in the book. So why the incendiary title? Years ago I asked him, and he said it was my publisher's idea. It may have sold more books, and certainly got a lot of press, but I don't think it helped the case. Still, I think much of the earlier decipherers have changed our worldview. It's more than just reviving a language. Okay, Now it's time for scribes' robes, pens, and ink. We're going to do some hieroglyphs. Last time, I gave you 4 sentences to translate. Let's see how you did. Our first sentence was, Ta goes down in another boat. Okay, what's our first word? Yes, ha, to go down, because it's the verb, and the verb comes first. Next, yes, pata, the subject, good. In is next, and that's our owl M. Now for another, we must decide whether to use the masculine or feminine form. What's boat? Clearly, it's feminine because it ends in a T. So we use ket, the feminine form of another. And that goes before the noun, so we can add it now to our sentence. Now we just add boat, and we have it. Ta goes down in another boat. Ha, pata, em, ket, depet. Good. Next we had, when this man fares downstream, the city is in joy. Remember, the when is understood, not written, so we start with the verb again. Yes, ched, to fare downstream. Notice the position of the boat determinative. It's not on the bottom of the line, it's in the middle. Often, if a low horizontal hieroglyph, like the boat, was by itself, the scribe might write it in the middle of the line because it looks better than at the bottom. We'll see it both ways. I want you to remember to always be flexible. Okay, we have to fare downstream. Now we need this man. Again, we have to decide, masculine this or feminine. No problem here with man, clearly masculine. So we use pen. And since it follows the noun, we add it after the man. Good. Now we have a compound sentence, one with 2 verbs and 2 subjects. For the second half, the verb is. In hieroglyphs, eu, the reed leaf and the quail chick. This verb could sometimes be omitted. The ancient Egyptians often left off the verb when it was a eu. Either way, it's correct. I just want you to remember again, be flexible. Next, we have city, the subject, pronounced niwit. So now we need enjoy. Well, the owl M is the in, and joy is our strange word with the double determinative. Remember? Reshwet? So that's our second sentence. When this man fares downstream, the city is in joy. It may have sounded something like Chedze pen iu niwit em reshwet. It's a long sentence, but you did it. Good. Next we have to translate, this woman listens to pata. Well, we know we start with our verb, which is sejum. Then we add this woman. Note that I've omitted the bolt Z and the T in woman. Often it's written in this simple form. We know this is feminine and follows the noun, so we add zet 10. Now we need the 2, and here we have a decision to make. Which 2 do we use? There's the mouth hieroglyph, the R, 2, for things, like to the boat. Well, Ptah is not a thing. He's a person. Actually a god, but you know what I mean. So we use the water hieroglyph for 2. Last, we just add Ptah, and we have it. Well done. Now for our last sentence. A man is there in the city. We start with our verb is. Next we add man. For therein, we can use our reed leaf and owl from our earlier vocabulary lesson. We don't have a word for the in ancient Egypt, so we just add city, niwit, and we're done. U, Z, M, niwit. Good. Now, let me just add a few vocabulary words, and then you'll be ready for some really interesting sentences. As usual, I'll give you the word, and you tell me how it's pronounced. Pronounce it. Yes, haru. The determinative at the end tells us it has something to do with the sun or time. The word means day. Here's another. Pronounced? Gera. Yes, remember the twisted flax hieroglyph is an H. The word means night. The determinative is a bolt of lightning coming out of the sky. We have day and we have night, so let's do another related word. Pronounced? Sound it out. Yes, something like yeah. The determinative is the phases of the moon, and the word means moon. Our next word has two determinatives. First pronounce it, then we'll figure out what it means. Yes, nejes. Nejes. The first determinative, the small bird, usually determines things that are small or bad. With the man hieroglyph at the end, we know it's a person. The word means commoner, who, in a social sense, is a small person. The word also means poor man, so it wasn't so good to be a commoner. Now for a couple of ideograms. You can't tell me how it sounds because it's an ideogram. It doesn't have any of our letters of the alphabet. I'll tell you how it's pronounced. Sesh. Can you figure out what it means? It's obviously a man of some kind from the last determinative in the word. The key is the other ideogram. It's writing implements. The rectangle that looks like a traffic light is a scribe's palette. The two circles are the red and black inks. It's solid, like Chinese ink. In the middle may be a little pot of water. You dip your brush, that's what's on the right side, in the water, touch the ink, and then you write. So a man with writing implements is a scribe. That's our word for scribe. This is a real scribe's palette. It wasn't just a tool for writing. When you walked by holding your scribe's palette, you showed the world you were somebody. Being a scribe was the way you moved up in Egyptian society. First you learned to write, then you got a job, perhaps as a lowly temple scribe, keeping track of temple inventory. Then if you were bright, you might be noticed, move up to a higher position, perhaps even a royal scribe associated with the pharaoh. There's even an ancient Egyptian wisdom text called Be a Scribe. It exhorts the young student to be a scribe. In the military, you're always marching, your feet hurt. Construction workers are always injured. Tanners smell terribly. But the scribe wears white linen and always has a good meal. So be a scribe. We'll look at that text carefully in a later lecture. It's wonderful. Let me show you another ideogram. Again, you can't tell me how it was pronounced because there's no alphabetic signs, but I'll tell you. Achet. The ideogram is a sun rising or setting in a notch in the mountain. The word means horizon. Ideograms of words that are feminine have the loaf T at the end, so we know it's feminine. For many ideograms, we know how they were pronounced from Coptic, which is the late form of Egyptian language. You'll hear a lot more about that in our next installment of our story on the decipherment of hieroglyphs. Two more words that are ideograms, and then we'll leave our vocabulary for today. You might be able to figure out how this one was pronounced. The rectangle is one of the alphabetic signs, remember? Yes, it's sh. So the word might be pronounced something like she. The little sign next to the ideogram stroke is probably an irrigation channel. It feeds a lake or pool, and that's what our word means, lake or pool. Here's our last word. It was pronounced ta, and it means land. The thin oval is a spit of land, and the three dots means it comes in chunks, like clumps of dirt. The other sign is probably an irrigation canal. We know it's masculine because it doesn't have a loaf T. So, for homework, let's translate 3 sentences. First, the moon rises in the sky. Next, the scribe is silent day and night. And last, this poor man knows a plan. Next time, we'll check our homework, complete the story of decipherment of hieroglyphs, and we will also learn biliterals, hieroglyphs that represent 2 sounds. I'll see you then.